Talk Ava. Learn English with confidence.
Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're talking about two English words that seem incredibly simple until you actually start paying attention to how native speakers use them. Those words are maybe and perhaps. For the longest time, I thought they meant exactly the same thing. Whenever I heard either one, I understood the conversation, so I never stopped to think about why someone chose one instead of the other.
I think that's a very common experience for English learners. You understand both words, but after listening to enough native conversations, you begin noticing something interesting. Sometimes people naturally say maybe, while other times they choose perhaps, and somehow both choices feel completely normal.
That's exactly what made me curious. A few days ago, I was watching two different interviews. One person answered a question by saying, "Maybe I'll do that next year." A few minutes later, another person said, "Perhaps that's the right decision." Both sentences sounded perfectly natural, but they created slightly different feelings, even though I couldn't immediately explain why.
That's one of the reasons I enjoy listening to real conversations instead of studying isolated vocabulary. Native speakers aren't sitting there thinking, should I choose maybe or perhaps? They simply choose the word that feels right in that particular moment.
I think that's something learners don't hear often enough. Many people expect every vocabulary question to have one simple rule, but real conversations are rarely that predictable. Language isn't just about meaning, it's also about personality, tone, and the situation you're in.
Exactly. Imagine you're deciding what to do on Saturday. A friend asks if you'd like to go hiking, but the weather forecast doesn't look very promising. One person naturally says, maybe. Another person smiles and says, perhaps. Both replies communicate uncertainty, but somehow each one creates a slightly different impression.
That's what fascinates me. I started paying attention during everyday conversations, and I realized these little words appear everywhere. People use them while talking about dinner plans, vacations, work, shopping, or even deciding what movie to watch. They're such small words, yet they quietly become part of almost every conversation.
I noticed something similar while talking with friends. If someone asks where they'd like to eat, the discussion usually becomes full of little uncertain answers. Someone suggests pizza, another person mentions sushi, and everybody starts sharing ideas. Those tiny words appear naturally because nobody has made a final decision yet.
Last weekend, I experienced exactly that. A group of friends wanted to meet for dinner, but nobody could agree on a restaurant. One person wanted Italian food, another suggested burgers, someone else preferred Mexican food, and the conversation kept changing every few minutes. The funny thing wasn't the restaurant, it was listening to how naturally everyone expressed uncertainty without sounding confused.
That's why these conversations are so useful for learners. You aren't memorizing vocabulary from a textbook. You're hearing words living inside real situations, and that makes them much easier to remember later.
I completely agree. The more I listen to everyday English, the more I realize fluency isn't built from difficult vocabulary. It's built from understanding ordinary words that appear in ordinary conversations every single day.
Before we continue, we'd love to hear from you. Which word do you usually use when you're not completely sure about something? Do you naturally say maybe? Or do you find yourself using perhaps more often? Let us know in the comments because it's always interesting to hear how English learners build their vocabulary.
Your question reminds me of something funny that happened last month. I invited two friends to meet for coffee on Saturday afternoon. I sent exactly the same message to both of them, and within a few minutes, I received two completely different replies. The first friend simply answered, maybe. The second friend replied, perhaps. Both responses meant they weren't completely sure, but somehow they felt surprisingly different when I read them.
That's actually a wonderful example because I think many native speakers would immediately notice that difference without even trying to explain it. The meaning is similar, but the personality of the message feels different.
That's exactly what surprised me. I found myself wondering whether one friend sounded more relaxed or whether the other sounded a little more thoughtful. Neither message was strange, they simply created different impressions even though they were answering the same question.
Text messages are fascinating because we don't have facial expressions or tone of voice to help us understand someone's feelings. Tiny vocabulary choices suddenly become much more noticeable. A single word can change the mood of an entire message.
The funny part is that neither friend had actually decided whether they were coming. A few hours later, one of them confirmed immediately, while the other canceled because of work. Their first replies didn't really predict what would happen. They simply reflected how each person naturally communicated.
That's why I always encourage learners to read conversations instead of only studying vocabulary lists. Real conversations teach you something much bigger than definitions. They teach you how people naturally express themselves in everyday situations.
I noticed something similar while helping a friend plan a weekend trip. Every few minutes, somebody suggested a new idea. One person mentioned the beach, another suggested the mountains, and someone else recommended staying in the city. Nobody was arguing. Everyone was simply exploring different possibilities together, and the conversation sounded completely natural because nobody felt pressure to make an immediate decision.
Those conversations happen all the time. Friends planning holidays, families deciding what to cook, coworkers discussing lunch, or couples choosing a film for the evening all have one thing in common. People are thinking aloud before making a final choice, and that's exactly why these little words appear so often.
I think that's one reason I enjoy listening to podcasts and interviews. You hear people speaking naturally instead of reading prepared speeches. They change their minds, hesitate for a moment, consider another idea, and continue talking. Those tiny moments teach English in a way that grammar exercises never can.
I couldn't agree more, because real English isn't perfectly planned. It's full of small decisions, changing opinions, and spontaneous thoughts. The more you listen to authentic conversations, the more these natural patterns become familiar.
If you're enjoying today's conversation, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's learning English.
In the next part of today's episode, Dave is going to tell us about a rainy Saturday that completely changed his weekend plans. It's a simple story, but it's another perfect example of how native speakers naturally use these little words without ever stopping to think about grammar. The conversation about text messages reminds me of a Saturday that didn't go anywhere near the way I'd planned. A group of friends and I had organized a picnic in the park. We'd been talking about it for almost 2 weeks because everyone finally had the same day free. We planned to bring food, play a few games, and spend the entire afternoon outside. Everything sounded perfect until I woke up and heard rain hitting the windows.
That's always disappointing because you spend days looking forward to something and then the weather decides it has completely different plans. The forecast might say one thing all week, but the sky often has its own opinion.
That's exactly what happened. The forecast had promised sunshine for days, but when Saturday arrived, dark clouds covered the entire city. I picked up my phone and opened our group chat because I knew everyone would be wondering the same thing. The conversation became surprisingly funny within a few minutes.
Let me guess, nobody wanted to be the first person to cancel the picnic.
That's exactly right. One friend wrote, "Maybe it'll stop raining soon." Another replied, "Perhaps we should wait another hour before deciding." A third friend said we could still go if everyone brought umbrellas. Nobody was arguing. Everyone was simply hoping the weather might improve.
I love moments like that because they show how naturally people speak when they're trying to make a decision together. Nobody's thinking about vocabulary, they're simply reacting to the situation as it changes.
We spent almost 30 minutes exchanging ideas. Someone suggested moving the picnic to the afternoon. Another person checked a different weather app and announced there was still hope. Then somebody else sent a photo of the heavy rain outside their house, and suddenly everyone started laughing because it was obvious the picnic wasn't going to happen.
That's one reason I enjoy group conversations. Everyone brings a different personality into the discussion. Some people stay optimistic until the last possible moment, while others accept reality much sooner. Neither approach is wrong, they're just different ways of looking at the same situation.
Eventually, one of my friends suggested meeting at a small cafe instead. Everyone agreed almost immediately because nobody wanted to spend the entire day at home. Looking back, I think the rainy weather actually improved the day because we ended up having much longer conversations than we probably would have in the park.
That's funny because some of my favorite memories began with disappointing plans. We often think the best days are the ones that go exactly as expected, but sometimes unexpected changes create even better experiences.
I completely agree. We spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing stories over coffee. At one point, someone looked out the cafe window and smiled because the sun had finally appeared. We all laughed because by then, nobody wanted to leave anymore.
That's such a perfect reminder that flexibility often creates the best memories. Sometimes we're so focused on the original plan that we forget something equally enjoyable might be waiting just around the corner.
I also realized something while reading our group chat later that evening. Everyone had naturally chosen words that matched their personality. Nobody was trying to sound more intelligent or more formal. They simply spoke the way they always do, and the conversation flowed effortlessly.
That's exactly why learning through conversations is so valuable. The more authentic conversations you hear, the more these little vocabulary choices begin feeling natural instead of confusing.
That rainy Saturday reminds me of something I've noticed over the years. Different people often have different favorite words, and after spending enough time with them, you begin recognizing those little habits without even thinking about it.
I know exactly what you mean. Some people have expressions they repeat almost every day. After a while, you can almost predict what they're going to say because those words become part of their personality.
My grandfather was a wonderful example. Whenever someone asked him a question that didn't have an obvious answer, he almost always paused for a moment before replying. He never rushed his response, and the conversation always felt calm because he liked taking time to think before speaking.
That's interesting because my younger cousin is completely different. If you ask him whether he wants pizza, whether he wants to play football, or whether he'd like to travel somewhere during the holidays, his first response comes almost instantly. He speaks quickly because that's simply part of who he is.
That's something English learners don't always notice. Vocabulary isn't only connected to meaning, it's often connected to personality as well. Some people naturally sound relaxed. Others sound thoughtful. Some enjoy speaking very directly, while others prefer leaving a little room for uncertainty.
Teachers are another interesting example. I remember one teacher from school who always spoke very carefully. She never sounded rushed, even when the classroom became noisy. She would listen to every question, smile, and then answer in the calmest voice imaginable. After a while, her speaking style became just as memorable as the lessons themselves.
I had a neighbor who spoke in a similar way. Every conversation with her felt peaceful because she never hurried through her thoughts. Even simple discussions about gardening or the weather somehow became enjoyable because she chose her words so carefully.
It's amazing how we remember people for the way they speak. We remember their favorite expressions, the rhythm of their conversations, and even the little words they use without realizing it. Those habits become part of their identity.
That's one reason listening practice is so important. When you hear many different native speakers, you begin noticing that English isn't spoken in one single style. Every person has their own personality, their own rhythm, and their own favorite expressions.
I think that's comforting for learners because many people worry about finding the perfect way to speak English. The truth is that native speakers don't all sound the same either. Some speak quickly, some speak slowly, some are very expressive, and others are naturally quiet.
Exactly. Fluency doesn't mean sounding exactly like someone else. It means becoming comfortable enough to express your own personality through English. Once that happens, conversations become much more enjoyable because you're no longer translating every sentence in your head.
That's probably why I enjoy podcasts so much. You don't just learn vocabulary, you also become familiar with different personalities, different speaking styles, and different ways of expressing the same idea. Over time, those small differences stop feeling confusing and start feeling completely natural.
I couldn't agree more.
The more real English you hear, the more you realize that language is about people rather than rules. Vocabulary becomes meaningful because it's connected to real voices, real stories, and real conversations. And that's exactly what makes learning enjoyable. Our conversation today has reminded me of something I noticed a few years ago. I spent so much time studying English through textbooks that I completely forgot one important thing. Native speakers don't learn vocabulary from lists. They hear the same words again and again while watching films, reading books, listening to conversations, and living everyday life.
That's such a good point, because I often tell learners to pay attention to the little words instead of only focusing on difficult vocabulary. People become excited when they discover a long, advanced word, but they sometimes ignore simple words that appear hundreds of times every single day.
Exactly. I remember watching an old detective movie one evening. The story itself was interesting, but what surprised me most was how natural the conversation sounded. The characters weren't trying to teach English. They were simply discussing clues, asking questions, and sharing opinions. Those small, everyday words kept appearing naturally throughout the film.
That's one reason I love watching interviews. Unlike movies, interviews aren't completely scripted. People pause for a moment, change their minds halfway through a sentence, laugh unexpectedly, or think carefully before answering. Those conversations sound wonderfully natural because they're happening in real time.
I experienced something similar while reading a novel last summer. The story wasn't difficult, but I noticed something interesting. Every character seemed to have a unique way of speaking. Some sounded confident, some sounded thoughtful, and others changed their minds several times during the same conversation. The vocabulary reflected each person's personality instead of following a perfect pattern.
That's exactly why stories are such powerful teachers. When vocabulary is connected to characters and situations, your brain remembers it much easier. You're not memorizing isolated words anymore. You're remembering people, emotions, and conversations.
I think podcasts work in the same way. Sometimes I finish listening to an episode and realize I don't remember every sentence the speaker said. What I do remember is how natural the conversation felt. Certain expressions stay in my mind because they appeared in interesting stories rather than grammar exercises.
That's one of the biggest differences between studying English and experiencing English. Studying often asks you to memorize. Real conversations invite you to listen, imagine, and understand. Over time, those repeated experiences quietly build your confidence without you even noticing.
I also enjoy listening to travel videos because the conversations feel so relaxed. People discuss restaurants, museums, local traditions, and funny experiences they have along the way. The language sounds comfortable because nobody is trying to sound perfect. They're simply sharing what happened during their day.
That's probably why learners improve so much when they surround themselves with authentic English. Every movie, book, podcast, and interview becomes another opportunity to hear ordinary vocabulary used naturally. Eventually, those little words begin feeling familiar because you've heard them in so many different situations.
Looking back, I think I learned more from regularly listening to real conversations than I ever learned from trying to memorize long vocabulary lists. Those conversations taught me rhythm, tone, personality, and confidence at the same time.
I completely agree. The best classroom isn't always a classroom. Sometimes it's a conversation between two people simply talking about everyday life.
Everything we've discussed today leads to one interesting conclusion. Fluency isn't always about knowing bigger words. Sometimes it's the smallest words that make the biggest difference. They're easy to overlook because they seem ordinary, but native speakers use them constantly.
That's absolutely true. Learners often ask me how to sound more natural, and they're usually expecting me to recommend advanced vocabulary. Instead, I tell them to spend more time noticing the little words people use every day. Those words quietly shape the rhythm and personality of a conversation.
I remember meeting an English learner who knew hundreds of impressive words. His vocabulary was incredible, and he understood difficult articles without any trouble. The only problem was that everyday conversations still felt difficult because he hadn't spent enough time listening to how ordinary English actually sounds.
I've met people like that too. They can explain complicated ideas beautifully, but ordering coffee or chatting with a neighbor feels surprisingly stressful. That's because everyday English depends much more on natural patterns than on impressive vocabulary.
That's one reason I stopped worrying about learning difficult words every day. Instead, I became much more interested in noticing the expressions native speakers repeated naturally. The more I listened, the more I realized the same ordinary words appeared in almost every conversation.
I had a similar experience while listening to podcasts during long walks. At first, I concentrated on understanding every sentence perfectly. Eventually, I relaxed and simply enjoyed the conversations. Strangely enough, that's when my listening improved the most because I stopped translating every word in my head.
I think that's an important lesson for everyone learning English. Trying too hard can sometimes make listening more difficult. When you're relaxed, your brain has more space to notice patterns instead of worrying about individual words.
Exactly. Language isn't a puzzle that needs to be solved one piece at a time. It's something you experience little by little. Every conversation teaches you another small pattern, another useful expression, or another way people naturally communicate.
Before we continue, we'd love to hear from you. Is there a small English word or expression that you hear all the time but still find interesting? It could be something you notice in movies, podcasts, or everyday conversations. Share it in the comments because your answer might help another learner discover something new.
That's one of my favorite parts of our community. Everyone notices different things while learning English, and when we share those observations, we all become better listeners together.
The more I learn, the more I believe fluency isn't built from extraordinary words. It's built from ordinary conversations repeated over time until they begin feeling familiar.
I couldn't agree more. The smallest words often carry the biggest lessons because they're the words native speakers trust every single day without even thinking about them.
After today's conversation, I realized something that completely changed the way I learn English. Years ago, I believed improving my English meant studying harder every single day. I collected grammar books, wrote long vocabulary lists, and tried to memorize as many words as possible. The strange thing was that even after learning hundreds of new words, real conversations still felt much faster than I expected.
I think many learners experience that stage. They know the vocabulary, they understand grammar, and they can complete exercises successfully. Then they watch an interview or listen to a podcast, and suddenly everything feels much more difficult. It isn't because they don't know enough English, it's because real conversations move differently from textbook exercises.
That's exactly what happened to me. One evening, I decided to stop worrying about understanding every single word. Instead, I simply listened to a conversation from beginning to end. I didn't pause the video every few seconds, and I didn't open a dictionary every time I heard something unfamiliar. At first, it felt uncomfortable, but after a few weeks, I noticed something surprising. I wasn't translating every sentence anymore. I was beginning to understand ideas naturally.
That's one of the biggest turning points in language learning. The moment you stop translating every word is the moment English starts feeling more like communication and less like a school subject. Your attention moves away from individual vocabulary and toward the meaning of the conversation.
I also began noticing little expressions that had always been there. They weren't difficult words, they were ordinary words people used every day without thinking about them. The more podcasts I listened to, the more familiar those expressions became. Eventually, I found myself using them naturally in my own conversations without consciously trying to remember them.
That's exactly why listening is so powerful. Every conversation quietly teaches you rhythm, pronunciation, vocabulary, and natural expressions at the same time. You may not notice your progress after one episode, but after months of regular listening, the difference becomes surprisingly clear.
something else changed as well. I stopped feeling nervous whenever I spoke English. I wasn't searching for perfect sentences anymore because I'd heard so many real conversations where people paused, changed their minds, corrected themselves, and continued speaking. I realized fluent speakers aren't perfect speakers. They're simply comfortable communicating.
I think that's such an important lesson because learners often imagine native speakers speak perfectly every second of the day. Real conversations are much more relaxed than that. People hesitate, laugh, forget words, interrupt themselves, and tell stories in a very natural way. That's normal communication, not a mistake.
Looking back, I think I spent too much time trying to sound perfect and not enough time simply enjoying English. Once I started enjoying the conversations themselves, everything became easier. Listening no longer felt like homework, it became something I genuinely looked forward to every day.
That's probably the best advice we can give anyone learning English. Stay curious, listen regularly, and don't expect instant results. Language grows quietly through small daily experiences, and one day you'll suddenly realize you're understanding much more than you ever thought possible.
Well, we've reached the end of today's conversation, and I have to admit something. When we started this episode, I honestly thought we were going to spend most of our time talking about 2 vocabulary words. Instead, we've spent our time talking about personality, conversations, listening, and everyday situations. I think that's exactly why these discussions are so enjoyable.
I feel the same way because language is never just about words. Every conversation tells us something about the people speaking, the situation they're in, and the feelings they're trying to express. That's why native speakers don't stop to think about vocabulary rules. They simply choose the word that feels most natural in that moment.
When I think back to today's stories, I remember the text messages from my friends, the rainy Saturday that became a cafe afternoon, and all the conversations we've shared about movies, books, podcasts, and everyday life. Those stories helped me understand these little words much more clearly than a grammar explanation ever could.
That's exactly why conversation is such an effective teacher. Instead of memorizing definitions, you begin connecting words with real experiences. Later, when you find yourself in a similar situation, those memories quietly help you choose the right expression without needing to stop and think about it.
I also hope today's episode encourages everyone to spend more time listening to authentic English. Watch interviews, enjoy podcasts, read simple stories, and pay attention to the little expressions people use naturally. Those ordinary words often become the building blocks of fluent English because you hear them again and again in different situations.
I completely agree. Don't worry if you don't understand everything the first time. Every conversation teaches your brain something new, even when it doesn't feel obvious. Over time, those small improvements come together, and one day you'll notice you're understanding conversations much more easily than before.
That's one of my favorite things about language learning. Progress often arrives quietly. You don't always notice it while it's happening, but then someone speaks English to you and you suddenly realize you understood the entire conversation without translating it in your head. Those moments are incredibly rewarding because they remind you that your daily practice has been working all along.
Exactly. Keep listening, keep enjoying real conversations, and don't be afraid of making mistakes. Every learner has moments of uncertainty, but every conversation brings you one step closer to speaking naturally and confidently.
If you enjoyed spending time with us today, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who's learning English. Your support helps us continue creating natural conversations that make learning both enjoyable and practical.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope today's conversation helped you hear the difference between maybe and perhaps in a natural way. And more importantly, we hope it inspired you to keep listening to real English every day. We can't wait to see you in our next episode where we'll explore another everyday topic together.